Esme's umbrella logo. Hello, my name is Judith Potts and I am the founder of Esme's Umbrella, which is the charity to raise awareness of a condition called Charles Bonnet Syndrome. Charles Bonnet Syndrome occurs when someone of any age has lost over 60% of sight. It causes vivid, silent, visual hallucinations, which range from disturbing to terrifying. It's very important to remember that this is not a mental health condition, but caused entirely by loss of sight. The kind of hallucinations which people experience can be very simple ones, like blobs of color, patterns, grids, all the way through to animals, birds, insects, and people. When someone sees the image of a human being, that image is usually wearing a costume of some kind, military or medieval, Edwardian. My own mother, the Esme of Esme's Umbrella, saw an Edwardian street child who followed her everywhere. Now let me hand you over to Professor Mariya Moosajee. Mariya is a consultant ophthalmologist at both Moorfields and Great Ormond Street hospitals, and she is going to talk about her work with children who develop CBS.
Thank you, Judith. My name is Professor Mariya Moosajee. I'm a consultant ophthalmologist based at Moorfields Eye Hospital and Great Ormond Street Hospital for Children. I'm also a Professor of Molecular Ophthalmology, and I have a research lab at University College London and the Francis Crick Institute. So we've been undertaking quite a lot of research into Charles Bonnet Syndrome in children, and we undertook a 9-year study at Moorfields, and we identified several children that were suffering from this. There was a mix in the type of hallucinations they were seeing. Some were seeing complex images, so these were distorted, scary faces, gargoyle-like images, animals such as spiders, and then others complained of the simplex images, so they just saw patterns and coloured dots. And some patients actually complained of seeing both types of images, so it can be quite variable. In terms of how those visual hallucinations made them feel, well, the main consensus was that it did cause stress, anxiety and fear. It's really difficult. It depends on their age. In young children, they may not be able to differentiate whether a hallucination is real or not real. And younger children sometimes have imaginary friends or pets. And so from an adult perspective, you don't know whether this is a visual hallucination or it's just your imagination. If it is scary, then obviously that can cause the stress and anxiety for them. But if it's just simple dots or patterns, it may not actually cause them any undue stress. But for those that are slightly older that can report seeing, for example, distorted faces, that actually led to a lot of stress in these patients. It affected their sleep, their social interactions. Some of these individuals actually had problems forming social relationships with friends at school. One individual actually ended up dropping out of university because they couldn't cope with the burden of their hallucinations. It affected their concentration and their ability to form relationships. There was one child that was particularly plagued with seeing spiders on their pillow at night, and so it really disturbed them at night, and it was a real trauma for the patient and the family to get to sleep, to the point that the child did not want to actually be in that room at night because they were so scared. And another patient reported seeing insects crawling on their food and ended up developing an eating disorder. The other important thing to bear in mind is that certainly in teenagers, they might actually start to think that they're developing mental health problems and schizophrenia, whereas in the adult population and elderly, they're more worried about dementia. And so this is the reason it's so important to talk to our patients about this in advance, so that they know that this is not a mental health condition and it can be dealt with easy coping mechanisms in most cases. Interestingly, most children said that they would not tell their friends about Charles Bonnet syndrome or their visual hallucinations. Now, this is also dependent on the age of the child and the child's personality themselves. In general, from my experience working with children, most children who have a degree of sight loss but are in normal schooling usually don't even share with their peers that they have a sight loss disorder, and sometimes they don't share it with their teachers. And so if they're not willing to share that, then usually they would probably be unlikely to share the fact that they're seeing things, because they'd be scared of what their peers may think about them. But then there are children who have quite severe sight loss and may have support at school already, and so may feel a bit more comfortable sharing their experiences because they have the support around them and their encouragement. But in general, I would say this is not an area that children would feel comfortable talking about freely. I think the reason that this condition has really gone unrecognised in children for so long is twofold. One, anecdotally, we know that we as healthcare professionals have not been good at asking parents and children about whether they're suffering from visual hallucinations or even mentioning Charles Bonnet syndrome. And that, I think, is the biggest contributing factor. I think if we start to just include questions about visual hallucinations in our history, or as part of the brief when we're just informing patients who are being diagnosed with sight loss conditions about Charles Bonnet syndrome, I think we'll enter into a lot more conversations and identify a lot more cases. We know that this is a condition that affects the elderly predominantly, and that's because sight loss conditions are more prevalent in the elderly, like glaucoma and age-related macular degeneration and diabetes. And so I just think we need to be sharing the condition with more families and more patients and just normalising this. The second reason is, as I mentioned, I don't think children want to talk about it or even know to talk about this. And that's why communication is so important, not just between doctors and patients, but with the orthoptists that are measuring children's vision, the opticians in the high street, optometrists seeing patients in clinic, junior doctors, consultants, social workers, qualified teachers of the visually impaired, family support services. The more we talk about this, the more everyone will realise that this is a complication of sight loss and nothing else to be worried or anxious about. Interestingly, from our studies, we did notice that a large proportion of children who developed Charles Bonnet syndrome actually had an inherited eye condition caused by changes in their genes. And so what I would just like to say is, please everyone, keep raising awareness of this condition. For those of you watching, there are various support groups and resources. A great resource for patients with inherited eye conditions is a website called gene.vision. And Esme's Umbrella is an amazing charity that will reach out and give you the support and point you in the right direction if you need it. Thank you so much, and over back to you, Judith.
For centuries, since 1760, when Charles Bonnet first documented what was happening to his grandfather, there has been no support at all. But now we have Esme's Friends groups, which are conducted on the telephone, online, face-to-face, and sometimes hybrid. These allow people with Charles Bonnet syndrome to come together to exchange their experience, because it's different for everyone, and to find coping strategies just to help them through. These strategies can be found on my website, along with all sorts of other information. Please visit www.charlesbonnetsyndrome.uk. That's spelt CharlesBonnetSyndrome.uk. It's very sad to think that for so long people were too afraid that they were developing a mental health condition to tell anybody. We now know that if someone whose sight is diminishing receives a warning that Charles Bonnet syndrome might appear, they can then recognize that first hallucination for what it is and not think that they are developing a mental health condition. The outcome is so much better. Talking to others who have the same condition is hugely helpful. So we have the Esmes Friends groups, we have counsellors. Retina UK has a buddy scheme, and the Macular Society offers counselling. So there is help out there. At the moment, that's about it, but there is research which has begun at various universities, including Oxford, and we hope that once we know a little bit more about the condition, we will be able to find better ways to support people and a proper pathway for diagnosis, treatment and support. When I launched Esme's Umbrella, one of my aims was to persuade the World Health Organization that this condition should be noted not just as a side effect of sight loss, but as a condition in its own right. And I'm very happy to say that with the help of Professor Andrew Dick here in the UK and Dr. August Kohlenbrander in the USA, we have achieved that. So now Charles Bonnet syndrome has its own coding in the World Health Organization's taxonomy of diseases and conditions called ICD-11. For the Retina UK helpline, call 0300 111 4000. To contact the Macular Society, dial 0300 30 30 111.